When I saw him holding the drawing, I froze, not because he found it, but because of what it meant. A crayon sketch, childish and messy, with stick figures labeled Mom, Dad, and me. The woman had my hair. The man wasn't him. And the little girl in the middle had my eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at it. I could see the way his expression shifted, confusion, curiosity, a flicker of something deeper. He didn't ask questions. He just turned the page to see another drawing. And another. A house. A dog. The three of us again. That sketchbook should have never been there. It was left behind by mistake, my mistake. I thought I had buried that part of my life so deeply no one would ever dig it up. But there it was, sitting in his hands on a Saturday morning while I stirred coffee like everything was normal. My heart wasn't racing from guilt, it was from the realization that my entire life might unravel in the span of a few innocent pages. He glanced at me across the kitchen. I smiled too quickly. He didn't smile back. I wanted to snatch it from him, tear it into 1,000 pieces, burn it, bury the ashes. But I just stood there, paralyzed. Because what he held wasn't just a drawing. It was the first crack in a perfectly polished mask. It was the door I had kept locked for 15 years finally creaking open. And I had no idea how to close it again. Before I explain what came next, and before I tell you the truth I've hidden for over a decade, leave a comment below. What city are you watching from? And, have you ever hidden something so big, so life-altering, that it changed everything once it came out? I used to believe I was two different people, and that as long as I kept those identities separate, they would never collide. One lived in a house with beige walls and a man who took his coffee with sugar. The other existed only on weekends, in a modest apartment 2 cities over, where a little girl waited with crayons and 1,000 questions I couldn't always answer. Every lie I told was small on its own. A weekend conference. Overtime. Charity work. Individually, they were harmless like bees before they swarm. It wasn't just a second life. It was a second self. A version of me that didn't wear silence like a coat. A version that laughed freely, who cooked pancakes on Sundays and forgot she was a ghost. The man I married didn't ask many questions. He never snooped. Maybe he was just busy. Maybe he trusted me. Or maybe, deep down, he knew something was off and preferred not to look directly at it. We'd been together for over 20 years. Our rhythm was predictable. Safe. Sterile. He was kind, he remembered to buy my favorite tea, but he hadn't touched my face in years. Not the way the other one did. The girl, our girl, thought I lived in 2 places because of my work. She never questioned it. Children don't dissect logistics. They accept what they're given. And what I gave her was a mother who only ever existed in fragments. The drawing book wasn't supposed to be in my car. She left it on the back seat after our last picnic, between her sweater and the half-eaten apple slices. I had meant to bring it in, but Monday was chaos and by Tuesday I had forgotten. Saturday morning, I handed my husband the keys so he could retrieve the groceries. I hadn't even remembered the sketchbook until I heard the front door creak and his footsteps on the tiles, slower than usual. I was pouring coffee. The smell was comforting, like always. I was halfway through my mental checklist, laundry, pharmacy, the call to my sister, when I saw him. Holding it. The book. I remember the tilt of his head, the way his eyes narrowed as he thumbed through the pages. He looked at me. No words. Just that long, quiet gaze that made the room feel smaller. I felt heat rising in my chest. Not panic, something worse. Awareness. The sinking certainty that the rules had shifted and I was no longer safe. He didn't ask me anything. He set the sketchbook down on the counter and said he needed to check the garden hose. Then he left. Just like that. I didn't follow him. I couldn't. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. The silence afterward was different. Not the silence we were used to, the kind that filled long dinners or Sunday mornings. This one was heavy. Watchful. He didn't mention the sketchbook again that day. But I noticed how he studied me. How he paused before speaking. How he looked through me, like trying to match my face to someone else's. By evening, I'd convinced myself he had dismissed it. Maybe he thought it was from a niece. Maybe he didn't connect the dots. Denial is powerful, it's the same force that had kept me going for so long. But that night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, counting the shadows. My phone buzzed once around 2:14 a.m., a message from the man in the other city, asking if we were still on for the weekend. I didn't reply. The next morning, my husband made pancakes. He never makes pancakes. He asked if I wanted to go with him to the hardware store. He never asks that either. I said yes. My voice shook. Driving past the edge of our town, I saw familiar highway signs. My chest tightened. If we took a different exit, we'd end up dangerously close to the apartment. But he turned the other way. Toward the store. He didn't say a word the entire drive. Later, while he browsed power tools, I excused myself to the restroom and sat on the closed toilet lid, trying not to shake. 15 years. 15 years of two lives, carefully orchestrated, perfectly timed. And all of it could unravel over a handful of colored drawings. That afternoon, I told my daughter I wouldn't be coming that weekend. She didn't cry. She just asked if I was okay. I told her I had a cold. When I hung up, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. Not the face of a criminal, not the face of a monster. Just a woman who had built something impossible and now watched it tremble. My husband didn't bring up the book. But that night, as I washed dishes, I noticed it was no longer on the counter. It had disappeared. So had his wedding ring. Not from his hand, but from the small porcelain dish by the sink where he always left it at night. And in that moment, I understood, he knew. He wasn't asking questions because he didn't need answers. He had them. Now it was only a matter of time before the truth spilled everywhere. And I wasn't ready. Not yet. But I would be. I had to be. The days that followed were a blur of normalcy that felt anything but normal. He didn't mention the drawings. He didn't change his tone, or his habits, or his daily routines. But I felt it. Like a splinter lodged just under the skin, painful only when touched, but always present. The silence between us was no longer filled with habitual comfort. It was alert, listening, charged with a new kind of electricity. I began to dread every glance, every casual question, every morning greeting. I watched him the way a fugitive watches police cars in the rearview mirror. I told myself he hadn't figured it out. That maybe he thought it was just a harmless picture. That he had moved on. But I knew better. The way he looked at me had changed. There was no accusation in his eyes. Not yet. But there was awareness, and that was worse. It meant the unraveling had started, silently and irreversibly. On Thursday, I drove to the city where they lived. I parked around the block, out of habit, and walked the rest of the way to the small two-bedroom apartment where my other life waited for me. The hallway smelled faintly of curry and cleaning products. The front door opened before I knocked. He stood there, taller than I remembered, though I had seen him only the weekend before. His eyes met mine with that familiar warmth, that quiet invitation I had leaned on for years. Behind him, laughter echoed from the living room, and I knew she was home. I stepped inside, dropped my bag near the coat rack, and removed my shoes like I always did. He reached for my coat, his fingers brushing mine briefly, automatic, easy, habitual. And yet something inside me flinched. Not from his touch, but from the unbearable contrast it now created in my mind. This space had always been a sanctuary. Now it felt fragile. He didn't ask why I was early. He rarely questioned things that might shatter the illusion we worked so hard to maintain. I appreciated that, more than he could know. But today, I needed to speak. The words pressed against the walls of my throat like water building behind a dam. Still, I held them in. She ran into the room with a handful of markers and wrapped her arms around my waist, chattering about her school day, her eyes bright. And I smiled, knelt, and listened, because for the next 10 minutes, I needed to be her mother and nothing else. Later, after she fell asleep with her stuffed fox clutched in her arms, we sat at the kitchen table. I stirred my tea, though I hadn't added sugar, and let the silence linger longer than I normally would. "I think he knows," I finally said. He didn't look surprised. He nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for me to say it. "The drawings?" he asked. I nodded. He found them. The ones she made for me. A beat of quiet passed between us. He didn't offer comfort or false hope. He knew better. After all these years, he knew that the truth wasn't something you could sidestep once it showed its face. "What are you going to do?" he asked gently. I didn't answer. I didn't know. We sat like that for a long while. The hum of the refrigerator filled the air, soft and monotonous. I stared at the wall clock and listened to the quiet tick between seconds. I had always lived in those spaces, in the gaps between obligations, between lies, between the ticking of time I had borrowed. He reached across the table, touched my hand lightly. We kissed. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't wild. It was the kind of kiss that came from familiarity, from history, from something built slowly, deliberately, with the full knowledge of its impossibility. But this time, it didn't offer relief. It didn't erase the dread that had settled in my chest. It only reminded me of how deeply the two worlds I had built were intertwined. When I got home later that night, the house was quiet. My husband was in the living room, reading. His glasses rested on the bridge of his nose, and the lamp next to him cast a soft pool of light on his book. He looked up when I entered, his expression neutral. "Good meeting?" he asked. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yes." "Long, though." He nodded again and returned to his book. I stood there, my coat still on, wondering if this was it, if we were going to pretend forever, or if the curtain would fall tomorrow, or the next day, or the next. I went to bed early. I couldn't bear the tension any longer. Lying in the dark, I listened to the sounds of the house. The faint creak of the floorboards as he moved, the click of the bathroom light switch, the soft brush of his toothbrush. Mundane things. Familiar things. But nothing felt normal anymore. I thought about the girl in the other apartment, sleeping with her fox. I thought about the man who had waited 15 years without asking me for more than I could give. I thought about the man in the next room, who once used to brush the hair from my face and whisper plans for summer holidays. And then I thought about myself, divided, exhausted, and terrified of losing everything. Because it wasn't just about what he might find out. It was about who I would be once he did. Would I be a mother with no daughter? A wife with no marriage? A woman with no anchor? Sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I woke before him. I brewed coffee, watched it drip into the pot like seconds bleeding into hours. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the spot where he had laid the sketchbook days ago. It was empty now. Cleared away, sanitized. He came downstairs, dressed for work. Said good morning. Kissed the top of my head. And I smiled again, like I always did. But inside, I was unraveling. And I knew it wouldn't be long before everything else did too. The following days unfolded like a slow collapse. Everything remained intact on the surface, the conversations, the dinners, the casual routines we'd cultivated over years of marriage. But underneath, I felt the foundation shifting. My husband's presence had changed. It wasn't overt. He didn't question my schedule. He didn't accuse or confront. But he had become alert in a way that was new. Every movement seemed calculated, every glance calibrated. He was listening more than speaking, watching more than reacting. I found myself second-guessing the most basic things. I hesitated before mentioning my plans. I rehearsed my answers before responding to simple questions. I stopped using my second phone in the house. Even my breathing felt louder in the quiet tension that now sat between us. I knew something was coming. I just didn't know when or how it would arrive. At work, I stared at spreadsheets without processing the numbers. My hand hovered over my coffee cup longer than it should have. A colleague asked if I was all right, and I offered the automatic smile, the practice just tired. They believed it. People always did. But I couldn't keep my mind from drifting back to the apartment. To the girl. To the way her arms wrapped around me without hesitation. To the way she leaned into me, trusting. There was no fear in her world, no understanding yet of what betrayal looked like. And I couldn't bear the thought of being the one to teach her. On Thursday, my husband called me during lunch. That was unusual. He never called unless something was urgent. I stared at the screen for a second before answering, heart thudding once against my ribs. He asked what time I'd be home. That was it. No reason, no comment. Just the question. I should be back around 6, I said. My voice sounded too even, too measured. I hated how quickly I had learned to sound normal while feeling anything but. He said okay, then paused, as if he wanted to add something but didn't. Then he hung up. That evening, I drove home with a kind of dread that made my stomach tight. I replayed the conversation over and over. What if this was it? What if tonight was the night it all came out? But when I walked in, everything looked as usual. The kitchen smelled faintly of roasted garlic. The table was set. He was in the living room, watching something on TV, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. He looked up, smiled slightly, and returned to the screen. My knees nearly gave out from the relief, and that terrified me more than anything else. The next morning, he left early. I watched him from the window, the way he walked with that same posture, the same measured pace. As if nothing had changed. As if I hadn't shattered the life we built without him even realizing it. I sat on the edge of the bed after he left, holding a pillow to my chest, feeling smaller than I had in years. That afternoon, I received a message from the other man. He sent a photo, a drawing our daughter had done at school. It was a family tree. At the top were 3 names. Hers. His. And mine. Seeing it felt like being punched in the lungs. I stared at the photo for a long time. The innocence of it. The quiet longing embedded in crayon lines and uneven letters. She had given me a place in her world that I had never publicly claimed. And now I wondered if I ever would be able to. I didn't respond to the message. I couldn't. I felt paralyzed. Caught between 2 entire lifetimes. On Saturday morning, I told my husband I had to work late. Another lie. Another thread in the web I had spent years spinning. He didn't question it. Just nodded, sipping his coffee. But there was something in the way he looked at me when he said goodbye. A slowness. Like he was memorizing my face. I drove to the apartment with knots in my chest. When I arrived, the girl was waiting at the window. She ran to the door before I even knocked. She told me about her week, about her new science project, about how she'd named her plants after Disney characters. I laughed in the right places, nodded when she expected me to, but I felt removed from it all, like I was watching a version of myself act the part of mother without fully inhabiting it. He asked if I wanted tea. I said yes, mostly to avoid speaking. I felt like any words I might say would shatter the fragile stillness we had created. After she went to bed, I stood on the balcony, holding the mug in both hands, staring into the dark. He joined me quietly, leaning against the railing beside me. "She's asking more questions," he said. I nodded. I knew that would happen. Children grow, their understanding expands. Curiosity deepens. And sooner or later, the stories we tell stop being enough. He asked what I planned to do. I didn't answer. I couldn't. There was no plan anymore. Just a countdown I couldn't see, ticking quietly beneath the surface. On Sunday evening, when I returned home, the house was quiet. He was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. I smelled basil and lemon. He said hello, like always. Asked if I was hungry. I said no. I wasn't. We sat in the same room, under the same lights, breathing the same air, and yet I felt worlds apart. He didn't look angry. He didn't look betrayed. But I knew he knew. I didn't need words to confirm it. Later that night, as I brushed my teeth, I noticed the mirror fogged slightly from the hot water. My face looked unfamiliar. Not older. Not sadder. Just different. Like I was observing someone else entirely. I thought about our wedding photo, still framed in the hallway. I thought about the last 15 years. About all the times I told myself I was doing the right thing, or at least the necessary thing. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I believed any of it. When I returned to the bedroom, he was already asleep, or pretending to be. I lay beside him in the dark, my hand resting inches from his. I wanted to reach out. I didn't. Because I didn't know who I was reaching for anymore. And I didn't know who would reach back. The days were becoming harder to manage, not because they were different, but because they weren't. Every morning still began with the kettle's whistle, the same ceramic mug, the same casual goodbyes at the door. But the simplicity of those routines had started to feel cruel. I went through the motions with such precision, it was almost theatrical. And somewhere deep down, I began to hate myself for how well I could lie with a smile and pass it off as care. What was worse than his silence was the possibility that he had accepted it all, that he had chosen not to fight, not to ask, not to demand explanations. There was a strange kind of grief in being given the space to fall apart, but only in private. He wasn't trying to stop me. He wasn't trying to understand. He was simply stepping back and letting the tide rise. And I couldn't decide if that made him cruel or kind. I started noticing small changes. Subtle things. He stopped asking me if I'd be home for dinner. He stopped reminding me about things I usually forgot. He left receipts on the table, seemingly at random: laundry, pharmacy, gases, things he would have normally tucked away or thrown out. But now they sat there like breadcrumbs. A reminder that he was documenting. Or perhaps proving to himself that he existed in this house too, even as I drifted further away. One evening, I walked into the study to get a notebook. I hadn't been in that room for weeks. It used to be where we'd sit together, he'd read, I'd sort paperwork or draft messages. But lately, I'd avoided it, as if the walls themselves remembered too much. As I opened the drawer, my fingers brushed something unfamiliar. A printed email. I didn't read it. I didn't need to. The subject line was visible: family counseling referral, confidential. He hadn't said a word about it. I sat down on the edge of the guest bed and stared at the floor. Part of me felt a wave of guilt, raw and immediate. But beneath that, deeper and colder, was the echo of something else. Resentment. He was making moves, forming plans, all while pretending things were normal. He was acting like the calm one, the quiet one, the adult in the room, and I was playing the role of the woman spiraling into her own deception. But he hadn't asked me why. Not once. He hadn't tried to know what led me here. What pushed me away. What I was aching for that made me build another life somewhere else. It wasn't just the betrayal that defined us now, it was the gap where the conversation should have been. That weekend, I didn't go to the apartment. I stayed home, pacing through rooms like a stranger. The silence was deafening. I found myself checking my phone constantly, expecting a message, hoping for none. He didn't ask where I was going. He didn't ask why I stayed. Sunday afternoon, I drove out to the park, not the one near home, but the one halfway between cities. The one with the benches beneath the oaks and the duck pond that always smelled faintly of wet leaves. I sat alone, wrapped in a scarf that still held his cologne faintly in the fibers. I watched couples walk by. Families. Children dragging parents toward playgrounds. And I thought of her, my daughter. The one who only knew me in halves. The one who thought her mother traveled too much, worked too hard, but always came home with hugs and sweets. I thought about the man I left behind when I chose this life. I thought about the man I ran to when I needed to feel seen again. And I thought about the woman I had become between them, fractured, careful, and endlessly exhausted. He called me that night. Not my husband, the other one. I hadn't answered his last few messages. I hadn't known what to say. But this time, I picked up. He asked if everything was all right. I said yes. He didn't believe me. Of course he didn't. We'd known each other too long for shallow answers. He told me she missed me. That she'd been quieter lately. Drawing less. Eating slower. I felt something twist inside me. Guilt again. Always guilt. I said I'd come next weekend. He hesitated before speaking again. Then he said something that stayed with me long after the call ended: "She thinks you're sad. She asked me if you were sick." That sentence cut deeper than any accusation ever could. I went to bed without brushing my teeth. I didn't undress. I lay there fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet rhythm of my husband's breathing beside me. And I hated him for sleeping. I hated myself for wanting to wake him up and demand a confrontation. I wanted him to care enough to shout. To slam doors. To accuse me of everything I had done. I wanted noise. Reaction. Anything but this agonizing restraint. But he just kept breathing, slow and steady. The next morning, I found the email again. This time, I read it. The referral was legitimate. The name of a clinic downtown. A therapist. A first appointment penciled in, but not confirmed. It felt like a passive invitation, one I was meant to stumble upon. I left it where I found it. At work, I caught myself staring at a spreadsheet for 20 minutes without realizing it. My inbox piled up with unread emails. I ignored calls. People stopped asking me to lunch. That evening, when I came home, he wasn't there. No note. No text. Just absence. I stood in the kitchen, holding the mail, unsure whether to feel relief or panic. It was nearly 9 when I heard the garage door open. He came in, set his keys down, removed his coat without a word. I asked if he wanted dinner. He said no. That was it. I watched him move through the house like a ghost. Or maybe I was the ghost. It was hard to tell anymore. That night, I cried in the shower. Not loudly. Not violently. Just enough for the steam to hide the evidence. The water ran hot, but I felt cold anyway. I pressed my forehead to the tile and tried to breathe. This wasn't grief. Not yet. It was the anticipation of it. The slow, aching wait for a truth that had already arrived, even if no one had spoken it aloud. I toweled off, changed into pajamas, and slipped into bed without turning on the light. He was already there, turned away from me. Neither of us said goodnight. I stared at the ceiling again, counting the seconds between his breaths. And I realized we weren't just drifting apart. We were already gone. I didn't plan on going back that weekend. I told myself it was too soon, that the tension in my home was thick enough to suffocate, that leaving would make things worse. But by Friday afternoon, my hands were trembling at my desk, and the silence waiting for me at home felt heavier than any excuse I could invent. I drove out of the city without telling anyone, my tires humming a rhythm that felt strangely like surrender. The weather had turned cloudy, gray, the kind of sky that made everything seem undecided. When I reached the apartment, the hallway smelled the same, familiar and unassuming. I knocked once, then let myself in. He was in the kitchen, leaning over the counter with a half-written grocery list and a chipped coffee mug. He looked up, eyes tired, but not surprised. We didn't say much. He moved aside, letting me pass. The girl wasn't home yet, she had after-school activities, he explained. I nodded. I took off my coat. I sat down at the table where we always ended up. I didn't have the strength to pretend anything was normal, so I said nothing. He didn't push. I watched the light shift through the window, settling into the warm gold of late afternoon. Everything in the room felt smaller somehow. The walls hadn't changed, but I had. Or maybe it was the way guilt distorted dimensions. When she came through the door, her voice filled the room like music I'd almost forgotten. She ran to me without hesitation, backpack bouncing, eyes bright. I held her close, breathing her in, letting her chatter wash over me like water over stone. She asked if I was staying the night. I glanced at him. He said yes, softly, without looking at me. We made dinner together. Pasta and salad, simple, easy. She grated cheese and told us about a game they played in gym class. I stirred sauce and nodded in all the right places, letting her carry the conversation. He opened a bottle of wine, poured just one glass, handed it to me without comment. We sat around the table like a family, not quite, but close enough to hurt. After she went to bed, I found myself standing by the living room window. The lights outside were few, most of the buildings dark already. He came in behind me, not speaking, but present in the way only someone who knows you deeply can be. We kissed. There was no urgency in it. No desperation. It was not about need, it was about history. It was the quiet acknowledgement of everything we'd built and hidden. It was gratitude and sadness and fatigue, all tangled into a single moment of contact. When we pulled apart, I didn't say anything. Neither did he. We spent the night together. The next morning, I woke before either of them. The apartment was still. I made coffee in silence, careful not to wake her. I stared at the steam rising from the cup and wondered how long I could keep balancing between two collapsing walls. The weight of the silence at home and the weight of the truth here were both pressing inward, and I no longer knew which would break me first. He came into the kitchen eventually, hair tousled, eyes heavy with sleep. He didn't touch me. He poured himself a cup, leaned against the counter, and finally asked what I was going to do. His voice was low, calm, but I could hear the fracture lines in it. I didn't answer right away. I didn't have one to give. He said she was asking more questions lately. About our relationship. About why I didn't live there. About why other kids had parents who came to school together and she didn't. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I had prepared for almost everything, logistics, timing, stories, but I hadn't prepared for her questions. I hadn't prepared for her noticing. Later that day, I sat with her on the couch while she showed me her latest drawing. Another family portrait. This time, the three of us were standing under a tree, holding hands. A dog sat beside us. We didn't have a dog. She pointed to each figure and named us with pride. She had written our names in large, uneven letters. Mine was first. She looked at me and asked, "Why don't you live here with us?" I froze. Not in fear, just in the realization that the moment I'd been avoiding had arrived. I swallowed, smiled gently, and said I had to work in a different place. That I came whenever I could. That some families lived in different homes, but still loved each other just the same. She nodded, too young to question further. But her eyes stayed on mine a little longer than usual. She was learning. She was watching. And I felt like I had just failed her, again. That evening, before I left, he pulled me aside and asked if I'd thought about telling the truth. Not everything. Just to her. I looked at him, tired and raw, and asked if that would fix anything. He didn't answer. Driving back home, I didn't listen to music. I let the road hum beneath me, mile after mile, trying to hold myself together. When I arrived, the house was quiet. My husband wasn't downstairs. The kitchen was spotless. A note sat on the counter. Went out. Don't wait up. I stood there reading it over and over, as if it might reveal something more the fourth or fifth time. I went upstairs, changed out of my clothes, and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't cry. There were no tears left. Only silence. I looked at the window, at the moon half obscured by clouds, and wondered when exactly the distance between us had become permanent. Later that night, I checked my phone. There was a message from him, the other man. "She was quiet after you left. But she smiled when she went to sleep." I stared at it, thumb hovering over the screen. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't want to. But because I didn't know who I was anymore. Or which version of myself had the right to speak. The following week passed in fragments. I moved through each day with the sensation of walking underwater, every movement slow, every thought muffled. At home, the silence between my husband and me had settled into something colder. It wasn't just absence anymore, it was intentional, deliberate, like a line drawn in chalk that neither of us would cross. We still exchanged words, but only the necessary ones. Schedules, errands, appointments. Nothing more. I started waking up earlier than usual, unable to sleep once the sky began to lighten. I would sit in the kitchen with my coffee long before he came downstairs, staring out the window, pretending that the trees swaying gently in the wind had answers for me. Sometimes I'd hear him stirring upstairs, the soft creak of the floorboards, the water running in the bathroom. And I'd wait, heart tight, for the moment he would appear. But when he did, there was never a confrontation. Only nods, only glances. It was almost unbearable, this quiet unraveling. I began to wonder if he would ever speak at all, or if he would simply vanish one day, leaving only the silence behind. On Thursday, I received a message from the school where my daughter studied. They were organizing a small weekend event, an informal family gathering with games, a picnic, and a few short performances. The invitation was written in cheerful language, with pictures of balloons and music notes. I read it 3 times before realizing I wasn't sure who they expected to attend. Me? Him? Us? I didn't respond to the invitation right away. I forwarded it to him instead, without a message. A few hours later, he wrote back. She wants you there. That was all. Those 4 words carried more weight than I expected. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen, trying to imagine what it would be like to stand beside them in public. To be seen. To no longer hide. I wasn't ready. But I wasn't ready to let her down either. At home that evening, my husband was already in the kitchen when I came in. He was making dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta and a salad. It used to be one of our quiet comforts. Now it felt like a ritual performed by strangers. He asked if I'd be home over the weekend. The question was casual, too casual. My throat tightened. I said I hadn't decided yet. He didn't react. Just turned back to the stove, stirring the sauce like my answer hadn't mattered. And maybe it didn't. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the occasional sound of traffic outside, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. My phone vibrated once on the nightstand. It was late. I reached for it instinctively. It was him. She's rehearsing a little poem to read. She's nervous. I read the message, then put the phone face down. I didn't reply. The next morning, I woke before the alarm. My husband was already up. His side of the bed was cold. I found him in the dining room, dressed, sipping coffee, the morning newspaper unopened in front of him. I poured myself a cup, and we sat there in silence. After a long moment, he asked, "Are you happy?" The question came so softly I almost thought I'd imagined it. I looked at him, unsure how to answer. Was I happy? Could I even measure that anymore? I said, I don't know. He nodded. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Like he already knew. He stood up, carried his cup to the sink, and rinsed it. Then, before walking out, he said, I know you're not where you said you were last weekend. I froze. He didn't wait for a reply. The door closed gently behind him. I sat there for a long time, coffee growing cold in my hand. So, he knew. Fully. Undeniably. And still, there had been no confrontation, no accusations. Just the truth, placed gently on the table between us, like a fragile object neither of us wanted to break. Later that day, I packed a small overnight bag. I didn't say anything to him. I left a note on the kitchen counter. I'll be back Sunday night. The drive to the other city felt longer than usual. My thoughts kept circling around his words, his tone, the way he had delivered that knowledge without anger. That made it worse, in a way. He was leaving the choice entirely to me, and now I had no one to blame for what came next. When I arrived at the apartment, she was already dressed for bed but still awake. Her eyes lit up when she saw me, and she rushed into my arms without hesitation. I held her close, tighter than usual, as if that could make up for the distance I had allowed to grow. He stood in the hallway, watching us. I met his gaze briefly, then looked away. There was too much in his eyes. Understanding. Patience. Maybe even sadness. The next morning, she practiced her poem at the kitchen table, her voice small and careful, stumbling over certain words. We listened, encouraging her gently, offering small suggestions. She took it seriously, her little face full of concentration. Watching her, I felt the tightness in my chest loosen slightly. In this moment, there was clarity. This was what mattered. Her. The event was held in a small park near the school. Families had spread out on blankets, sharing snacks and laughter. Children ran between clusters of adults, shouting and laughing. We arrived together, but didn't hold hands. We didn't need to. Just being there, the three of us, was enough. She stood in a line of children, waiting her turn to recite her piece. When it came, she stepped forward with a nervous smile. Her voice trembled at first, but grew steadier with each line. She ended with a proud, almost shy glance toward us. And then she said, clearly, "Thank you to my mom and dad for helping me practice." There was a pause in the crowd. Nothing dramatic. Just the soft silence that follows a child's words when they don't quite match the expectations of the room. I felt my breath catch in my throat. No one corrected her. He placed a hand lightly on my back, a gesture of quiet support, not possession. I nodded, barely. Later, we sat beneath a tree while she played with the others. He offered me water from the picnic bag. I took it, hands shaking. "She sees it that way," he said quietly. I nodded again. "And you?" he asked. I looked at our daughter running across the grass. At the sun filtering through the branches above us. At the people nearby who had no idea of the life we'd built behind closed doors. "I don't know yet," I whispered. He didn't press. That night, after she was asleep, we didn't talk much. I sat by the window while he cleaned up the kitchen. There was no kiss this time. No silent promises. Just the weight of choices waiting for me on both sides of a line I had drawn myself. I lay awake long after the lights were off, listening to her breathing in the next room. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't afraid of being caught anymore. I was afraid of choosing. I woke up before the sun, wrapped in the unfamiliar warmth of the spare bed, the one I usually avoided. The apartment was quiet except for the distant hum of a car passing outside and the subtle creak of old floorboards contracting with the changing temperature. For a moment, I lay still, watching shadows shift across the ceiling, thinking of nothing and everything all at once. I could hear her soft breathing from the adjacent room, slow and even. That sound had become one of the few things that still centered me, a reminder that whatever chaos I had built for myself, she remained untouched by it, for now. Down the hall, I could sense him moving quietly, trying not to wake either of us. The smell of coffee reached me a few minutes later, subtle and grounding. I rose, wrapped myself in a light sweater, and stepped out into the living room. He was already at the kitchen table, reading something on his phone, his glasses sliding slightly down his nose. I sat across from him. We didn't speak. There was no need. The silence between us had long since become its own language. The weekend had been quiet, even peaceful on the surface. The school event had left us both reflective, if not emotionally exhausted. She had smiled for days, repeating bits of the poem around the apartment, unaware of the gravity her words had carried. She had given us a title, Mom and Dad, spoken aloud in a way that could no longer be taken back or explained away. It had been a declaration, a line drawn not by me or him, but by her. He passed me a mug without comment, the coffee already sweetened the way I liked it. I took a sip, the warmth grounding me more than I wanted to admit. Outside the window, the light was beginning to stretch across the rooftops, pink and gold and faintly promising. He finally looked at me and said, "You should talk to him." The words landed without surprise. I had been expecting them. I just hadn't wanted to hear them spoken aloud. "I know," I said, voice low. "She's starting to ask things I don't know how to answer." I nodded, feeling the heaviness in my chest settle deeper. It wasn't that I hadn't wanted to talk to my husband. It was that I didn't know where to begin. What explanation could possibly justify 15 years of lies? What story could I tell that didn't make me the villain? By the time she woke up, the apartment was already filled with the sounds of a normal morning. Cereal bowls clinking, drawers opening and closing, shoes being laced. She hugged me tightly before breakfast and asked if I'd take her to the bookstore later. I promised I would, though the promise felt like a thread fraying in my hand. Around noon, I packed my things. I didn't want to leave, but I knew I had to. The longer I stayed, the more it felt like stealing something that didn't fully belong to me. Before I left, he pulled me aside. We stood in the narrow hallway between the kitchen and the door, the hum of the refrigerator loud in the silence. "She needs answers," he said. "Soon." "I know. Do you?" I didn't answer. I just looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, the quiet concern that had replaced so many years of hope. He wasn't angry. He never had been. But that didn't mean he wasn't tired. I drove home in silence, the radio off, the window slightly cracked. The cold air stung my face, and I welcomed it. I needed to feel something other than guilt and indecision. When I arrived, the house was quiet. His car was in the driveway. The lights were on. My chest tightened. I walked inside and found him in the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch, holding something in his hands. It was a photo. One I hadn't seen in years. We were younger in it, laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. I was leaning into him, his arm wrapped around my shoulders, and we looked happy. Authentically so. I stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure whether to speak or wait. He didn't look up right away. When he did, his eyes were tired, but not unkind. He asked me to sit down. I did. The conversation began slowly. We didn't yell. There were no accusations hurled, no tears. Just questions. Real ones. Painful ones. He asked me when it started. I told him. He asked if I still loved him. I didn't answer. He asked if the child was his. I told him no. Each truth fell into the space between us like a stone into water, quiet, but with ripples that would never truly settle. He didn't say much after that. He sat back, staring at the photo again, then finally asked the only question that truly mattered. "What do you want?" I didn't know how to answer. Not because I hadn't thought about it, but because every version of the future I imagined came with a loss I wasn't ready to face. Either I lost the life I had built here, with its stability and history, or I lost the life I had kept hidden, fragile and blooming despite the odds. He stood up, set the photo down on the coffee table, and told me he needed space. A few days. Maybe longer. I nodded, heart pounding. That night, I packed a small bag and left. Not to run. But to give him what he asked for. I didn't go to the apartment. I checked into a hotel on the outskirts of town. A quiet place. Neutral. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared out the window at nothing in particular, replaying everything we had said. Every word. Every pause. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't cried. But the grief in his voice was louder than any outburst could have been. I lay awake most of the night, thinking about her. About how I would eventually have to explain not just who I was to her, but what I had done. About how I had built a world on foundations that were never meant to last. When I finally slept, it was shallow and restless. Morning came too quickly. The phone buzzed once around 7 a.m. A message from him, the other man. "We're here when you're ready." I set the phone down, closed my eyes, and let the words linger in the quiet. Not if. When. I stayed in that hotel room longer than I'd intended. 2 nights stretched into 3, then 4. Time blurred. Each morning I opened the curtains to the same view, an empty parking lot, a row of trees stripped bare by the season, and the steady, indifferent sky. I kept the television off, the lights dim, and the windows cracked just enough to let in the sound of distant traffic. It was easier than facing anything real. The room was quiet, sterile, and anonymous, perfect for disappearing, if only for a little while. I didn't reach out to either of them. Not to my husband, not to the man I'd loved for so long. I didn't call my daughter either. I knew she'd be fine for a few days, that he would take care of her, keep her busy. But I also knew the clock was ticking. The longer I waited, the more questions would take root. And eventually, waiting would stop being neutral. It would become abandonment. Each night I laid awake in the stiff hotel bed, staring at the textured ceiling, trying to assemble the pieces of a future I could live with. But every path I imagined ended with someone losing something they didn't deserve to lose. And I couldn't bring myself to decide who it would be. By the fifth morning, I packed my bag. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. I checked out without speaking to the clerk, avoided my own reflection in the glass doors, and stepped out into the chilled morning air. The drive home felt longer than usual, even though there was no traffic. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than necessary, and my eyes kept drifting toward the empty passenger seat. I turned the radio on for the first time in days but couldn't focus on the music. I turned it off again. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same. Still. Quiet. Detached. I sat in the car for a full minute before getting out, bracing myself for whatever I would find inside. I didn't expect an apology, nor did I deserve one. I expected avoidance, maybe distance. What I didn't expect was the envelope on the kitchen table. My name was written on it in his handwriting. The flap was unsealed. I sat down, opened it, and began to read. It wasn't long. A page and a half at most. The sentences were calm, deliberate, as if he had chosen each word carefully. He didn't ask questions. He didn't accuse. He didn't even write about the pain directly. He simply explained how long he had known, or at least suspected. How he'd spent years watching me slip away, piece by piece, and convincing himself it was just a phase. A difficult year. A passing storm. He wrote about how he had loved me. How he had once believed we were building a life that made sense. And how, somewhere along the way, the meaning had disappeared. Not because of one person. Not because of one betrayal. But because of years of silence, small neglects, and carefully avoided truths. And then, in the last paragraph, he wrote something that stopped me cold. I know about the girl. I've seen pictures. I know her name. I froze. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I read the line again. And again. He knew. Not just about the affair. Not just about the apartment, the trips, the second phone. He knew about her. Our daughter. He hadn't said it aloud when we spoke. He hadn't even hinted. But now, in this letter, he had opened the door to something much deeper. Something far more dangerous. And then, the final line, I won't interfere. But I also won't lie for you. My hands trembled slightly as I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. I sat at the table for a long time, staring at nothing. I tried to imagine what he must have felt when he realized. Whether it had come all at once or slowly, like fog lifting. I thought about the day he found the drawing. That moment was the first crack, and now, months later, the fracture had widened into something unrepairable. He wasn't threatening me. There was no anger in his words. But there was finality. He was telling me that the boundary between my lives no longer existed. That the walls I had built had collapsed. I didn't know what he planned to do next. But the worst part was realizing that it no longer depended on him. It depended on me. The phone rang later that afternoon. It was my daughter's school. She had forgotten her lunch and asked if someone could drop it off. The secretary said she had tried reaching her father, but hadn't gotten through. I grabbed my keys, threw together a small lunch, and drove across town. My hands were still shaking slightly when I arrived. The receptionist smiled politely as I signed in, and I walked the long hallway to her classroom with a paper bag in hand. When I opened the door, she looked up and smiled, surprised but happy. She hugged me tightly, whispering thank you. Her hair smelled like shampoo and crayons. I kissed the top of her head, and for a brief moment, everything inside me settled. But when I looked up, I saw one of the other mothers watching me. A familiar face, one I had seen at the school picnic. Her expression wasn't hostile, but it wasn't casual either. It was curious. Questioning. She didn't say anything. She turned back to her conversation. But I knew, in that instant, that word was spreading. We had been invisible for years. But now, the veil was thinning. Later that evening, I sat in the living room with the letter again. I reread the part about not lying. I knew what it meant. He was drawing his own line now, just as I had drawn mine. And I couldn't blame him for it. The phone buzzed. A message from my daughter's teacher, a quick thank you for bringing lunch. And then, casually, she added, she told us today her mommy might come to Parent Day next week. She was really excited. I sat with that message for a long time, staring at the words. Might come. Not would. Might. Because even at 12, she knew better than to count on anything. I stood up, walked to the bathroom, and looked at myself in the mirror. My face was pale, drawn. Older than I remembered. But the eyes were the same. Tired, yes. But still searching for something to hold on to. I reached for my phone again. Scrolled through messages. Paused on the one he had sent days ago. We're here when you're ready. I stared at those words. Then I typed 2 more. I'm coming. And pressed send. The morning I left, the house felt hollow, as if its walls already knew I wasn't coming back the same. I packed lightly, just a few essentials and a clean set of clothes. I didn't write a note this time. There was nothing left to explain in ink. He knew everything now. And I had said all I could without falling apart. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the bite of a season trying to shift. The sky was clear for once, pale and cloudless, offering no omens, no warnings. Just silence. I turned the key in the ignition and drove, each mile a slow exhale, a surrender to the fact that there were no more excuses, no more shadows to hide behind. When I arrived at the apartment, he opened the door before I even knocked. His face was tired, not from sleep but from waiting. We stood there for a moment without speaking. Then I stepped inside. She was in the living room, cross-legged on the floor, building something with colored blocks. When she saw me, she lit up in a way that made my throat tighten instantly. She ran to me, arms wide, and I knelt to catch her, holding her close, breathing her in. She talked quickly, telling me about a story she had written at school, about a math problem she had solved without help. I nodded, smiled, murmured encouragement, but I could barely hear her over the rush of guilt and longing in my chest. I stayed for dinner that night. The 3 of us sat around the table, and it felt almost ordinary. He made a stew he knew I liked. She set the table with mismatched napkins and insisted we all drink from the same colored cups. We laughed at her insistence. The sound felt unfamiliar coming from me, but it came anyway. After she went to bed, we sat on the couch, a quiet space between us. I could feel the weight of his questions, but he didn't push. Instead, he asked if I had told my husband about her. I shook my head. Not in those words, I said. But he knows. He didn't react. He just looked down at his hands, folded together tightly. When he spoke again, his voice was soft. She deserves to be acknowledged. Not just here. Not just by me. I knew he was right. I also knew I wasn't ready. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how to make up for all the years I hadn't. The next morning, we took her to school together. She held both our hands as we walked toward the building. At the gate, she hugged me longer than usual. "Don't go away for so long again," she whispered. I promised I wouldn't. This time, I meant it. After she disappeared into the building, we stood there for a while, watching other families arrive. I saw familiar faces, other parents from the event. A few nodded politely. One or two glanced curiously. The murmurs had begun, I could feel it. The questions were no longer just at home, they were beginning to spread through the cracks of this life too. We walked back slowly. I asked if he had ever told anyone. He said no. He'd never wanted to put pressure on me, not with the risk I was taking. But he added that soon, there wouldn't be a way to avoid it. The more she grew, the more questions would come. Back at the apartment, he asked me what I wanted. I hated that question. It was too big. Too sharp. I didn't know how to answer it without breaking something. "I want her to be okay," I said finally. "I want her to grow up without shame or confusion." He nodded. "And what about you?" I didn't respond. Later that day, I called my daughter from the marriage. She lived in another city now, in a small studio apartment above a bookstore. She answered after a few rings, her voice cautious. We hadn't spoken in weeks. I told her I wanted to see her. That I had things to say, things I should have said a long time ago. She hesitated. Then she said, "All right." I made the drive the next morning. The city was busy, full of people who didn't know me, who weren't tracing the lines of my past with every glance. I liked that anonymity. When I arrived, she was waiting outside, arms crossed, her face a mixture of suspicion and restrained kindness. She led me upstairs. The apartment was small but warm, filled with books and plants. I sat on the couch while she made tea, and I tried to find the right opening. I told her the truth. Not all at once. Not perfectly. But honestly. I told her about the years. About the child. About the man. About the weight of it all. She didn't interrupt. She didn't cry. She just listened, her eyes locked on mine, unmoving. When I finished, the silence was unbearable. She finally asked, "Why didn't you tell me before?" I had no answer that didn't sound hollow. I told her I was scared. That I thought I could protect her. That I thought I could keep everything separate. She laughed once, not cruelly, just quietly. "You really believe that?" I nodded, ashamed. She stood and walked to the window, arms folded, back to me. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "She's my sister. Right?" I said yes. She turned around. Her face wasn't angry. It wasn't even hurt. It was just sad. "I think I need time," she said. "But I don't want to never speak to you again." It was the most grace I could have hoped for. I drove back that evening, exhausted in a way I couldn't name. When I got home, the house was dark. My husband wasn't there. No lights. No noise. Just stillness. I turned on a lamp, sat at the table, and read his letter again. The words felt heavier now, more final. But also clearer. We had both known this day would come. Now there was only one left. The one I feared the most. Telling her. The little one. Not through half-truths, not through omission. But fully. She had already begun to understand. The way children do, without needing confirmation. She'd drawn her own conclusions, built her own truth. I just needed to catch up to her. That night, I messaged him. I want to talk to her. Together. This weekend. He replied almost immediately. She'll be ready. Saturday came with a kind of silence I hadn't felt before. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the weight of knowing what was coming. The hours moved slower, each one reminding me that I was running out of time to rehearse, to prepare, to frame the moment in some gentler way. But no matter how many ways I played it out in my head, nothing felt right. How do you tell a child that the world she knows is only part of the story? How do you give her the truth without stealing her stability? I arrived at the apartment just after noon. The sky was pale and overcast, the kind of dull gray that makes the world feel still, suspended. He opened the door with a quiet nod. No words. We had said everything we needed to say in the messages that preceded this. She was in her room, drawing. We sat in the living room for a while, both of us avoiding eye contact, sipping coffee like we were trying to stretch out the time. Eventually, he stood and called her gently. She came out with a sketchbook in her arms and her usual brightness in her eyes. She sat between us without hesitation, curling her legs underneath her. Her presence filled the room with warmth I didn't feel I deserved. She began flipping through her drawings, explaining each one with pride. A house with 3 windows and a red roof. A butterfly with mismatched wings. A family of stick figures standing under a tree. When she pointed to that last one and said, "That's you, and that's Dad, and that's me," I felt something in my chest shift, something long overdue. I waited until she looked up at me again. Her eyes were so open, so trusting. "There's something we want to talk to you about," I said. She tilted her head slightly, curious but not alarmed. I looked at him. He gave the slightest nod. I took a breath, steadying my voice. "You know how some things are harder to explain than others?" She nodded slowly. "Well, there's something important about our family that we haven't really told you yet. And it's not because we didn't want to. It's because we weren't sure when the right time was." Her brows furrowed a little, but she stayed quiet. I reached for her hand, and she let me hold it. It was warm and small and impossibly trusting. "The truth is, you're our daughter. Both of ours. Not just in the way we've been living, but really. I'm your mom." She blinked at me, processing. "But, you already are," she said simply, as if correcting an obvious mistake. I smiled softly. "Yes, but not just when I visit. Not just in secret. I've been your mom since the day you were born." She looked down at her sketchbook, then up at him. Then back at me. "So why don't we live together?" That question hit harder than any accusation could have. And it wasn't laced with anger. It was just confusion. I felt my throat tighten. Because I made some choices a long time ago. Choices that made everything more complicated than it should have been. Her voice was even smaller when she asked, "Does your other family know about me?" I paused. "They do now." She looked at me, her eyes wide and unreadable. "Did they not want me to exist?" "No," I said quickly, too quickly. "It's not that. It's never that. It was about me. I was afraid of what would happen if I told the truth. And that was wrong." She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just looked down again, flipping through her sketchbook slowly. After a long silence, she said, "So? I'm not a secret anymore?" "No," I whispered. "You're not. The air in the room felt heavier after that. He reached over, placed a hand on her back. She leaned into him instinctively, not pulling away from me, but not rushing toward me either. We sat like that for a while, quiet, steady. Later, we took her to the park. She didn't speak much, but she didn't seem angry. She asked if we could get ice cream, and we did. She chose the same flavor she always did, mint chocolate chip, and asked for extra sprinkles. On the bench, watching her eat, I felt like I was looking at her for the first time. Fully. No longer half hidden by the roles I had created for myself. She was whole. And now, maybe, I could start being whole too. That evening, after we returned to the apartment, he asked if I wanted to stay for dinner. I said yes. She helped set the table. Her movements were slower, more thoughtful than usual. At one point, she paused and looked up at me. Do I have a sister? The question caught me off guard. I nodded. Yes. You do. Can I meet her someday? I felt a lump form in my throat. I hope so, I said. She nodded once and went back to arranging the forks. After dinner, I helped her with her bath, like I used to when she was small. She let me brush her hair while she told me about a book her teacher was reading to the class. I listened, grateful for every word. When she climbed into bed, I sat beside her while she arranged her stuffed animals. She looked at me with a quiet intensity and said, I don't want you to leave again. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't promise something I wasn't sure I could give. So I said, I don't want to either. She seemed to accept that. She reached for my hand and held it for a moment before turning onto her side. I stayed until her breathing softened, until the tension left her body. Then I rose, walked quietly out of the room, and closed the door behind me. He was in the kitchen, cleaning up. I leaned against the doorway, watching him for a moment. She took it better than I expected, I said. She's stronger than both of us. We didn't say anything else for a while. Then he asked, so what now? I looked around the apartment, at the drawings on the fridge, the half-read books on the table, the evidence of a life that had kept moving forward even without me in it. I don't know, I said truthfully. But I'm not going to disappear again. He nodded. That's a start. And it was. Not a resolution. Not a happy ending. But a beginning. Finally.